Imagine a king born to rule one of the greatest empires the world had ever known, yet cursed by his own bloodline to endure a life of suffering and decay. This is the dramatic tale of Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg monarch, whose troubled reign marked the downfall of a once mighty dynasty. What dark forces led this unfortunate ruler to be known throughout history as the Bewitched? And how did his tragic fate seal the collapse of an empire that once spanned continents? Charles II entered this world in 1661, heir to one of Europe's most influential families, the Habsburgs. For centuries, they had dominated vast territories across the globe, ruling lands from the Americas to the Philippines. But their obsession with keeping power within the family led to marriages between close relatives, generation after generation. This dangerous practice created a cascade of genetic problems that culminated in the fragile, sickly figure of Charles. From his earliest days, Charles bore the heavy burden of his ancestry's mistakes. His jaw was so severely deformed he could barely speak or chew. His body was weak, his mind often clouded. Yet upon his small, hunched shoulders rested the fate of the Spanish Empire. His 40-year reign became a desperate struggle filled with political intrigue, foreign wars, and an increasingly frantic search to produce an heir who could continue his line. Court physicians prescribed everything from potions made with crushed human skulls to bizarre ritual baths, all in vain attempts to strengthen the king's health and fertility. Today, we'll unravel the life and legacy of this king, who, despite his profound weaknesses, left an indelible mark on Spanish and European history. We'll explore how the greatest empire of its age crumbled under the weight of Habsburg inbreeding, and how the death of one sickly monarch triggered a continent-wide war that would reshape the balance of power for centuries to come. If you're fascinated by history's darkest secrets and want to discover the mysteries behind the rise and fall of great empires, like this video, subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles and join us on a journey through the shadows of royal history. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode where we bring the past to life. When Carlos II inherited the Spanish throne, he inherited much more than just power and wealth. He became the living embodiment of a dynasty's genetic collapse, the final tragic result of generations of Habsburg inbreeding. The Habsburg family had risen to prominence through a carefully calculated marriage strategy. "Let others wage war," went their unofficial motto. "You, happy Austria, marry." For 2 centuries, the Habsburgs had woven a complex web of family alliances, keeping power tightly within their bloodline. First cousins married first cousins, uncles married nieces. The family tree of the Habsburgs didn't branch out, it folded in upon itself. By the time Carlos was born in 1661, this genetic isolation had created a perfect storm. His father, Philip IV, was his mother's uncle. His grandmother was also his aunt. In fact, despite having 32 positions in his family tree, where 32 different great-great-great-grandparents should have appeared, Carlos had only 10 unique ancestors. The devastating consequences of this extreme inbreeding were immediately apparent. From birth, Carlos exhibited severe physical deformities. Most notable was his Habsburg jaw, an extreme mandibular prognathism so pronounced that his teeth couldn't meet, making eating a painful ordeal and clear speech nearly impossible. His tongue was oversized for his mouth, causing him to drool constantly. His head was disproportionately large for his frail body, and he couldn't walk until age 8. Contemporary accounts describe a pitiful figure. The French ambassador wrote that Carlos was so ugly as to cause fear and looks ill. Court painters struggled to portray him kindly, but even their most flattering portraits couldn't hide his distorted features. By adulthood, Carlos could barely stand upright without assistance, suffered from chronic digestive problems, and experienced frequent seizures. But perhaps the most devastating aspects of Carlos's condition were his intellectual disabilities. He received little formal education, partly because his mind couldn't grasp complex concepts. He was described as always on the verge of death, but repeatedly baffling Christendom by continuing to live. His mental development remained childlike throughout his life, making him easily manipulated by court factions. Did you know that Carlos II was subjected to exorcisms? Many believed his inability to produce an heir was the result of a curse. As his health deteriorated and no children came from either of his marriages, desperation grew. Court physicians proved useless, so priests and even sorcerers were summoned to the palace. They performed elaborate rituals trying to free the king from supposed evil spirits. Carlos endured bizarre treatments, drinking potions made from crushed human skulls, bathing in oils mixed with animal blood, and submitting to painful physical purifications. These torturous procedures only further weakened his fragile constitution. The political consequences of Carlos's condition were immense. Unable to effectively rule, he became a puppet for various court factions. His mother initially ruled as regent, followed by his illegitimate half-brother, Don Juan José of Austria. Foreign powers circled like vultures, knowing the sickly king couldn't produce an heir. Spain's enemies grew bolder, sensing weakness at the heart of what had once been Europe's mightiest empire. The Spanish economy collapsed under mismanagement. Military defeats mounted. Colonial territories began slipping away. The once mighty Spanish Habsburg Empire was crumbling around a king who could barely function. Carlos himself seemed aware of his tragic circumstances. In rare moments of clarity, he reportedly wept over his inability to rule effectively or sire children. "I am the result of so much inbreeding," he supposedly lamented. Though we'll never know if he truly understood how his family's pursuit of power through intermarriage had doomed him from conception. By consolidating their power through intermarriage, the Habsburgs had inadvertently engineered their own extinction. The embodiment of their dynasty's genetic collapse sat helplessly on the Spanish throne, watching an empire disintegrate around him. Carlos II wasn't just the last Habsburg king of Spain. He was living proof that even the mightiest dynasties cannot defy the laws of nature forever. His tragic life stands as one of history's most stark warnings about the consequences of unchecked inbreeding among royal families, whose obsession with pure bloodlines ultimately led to their downfall. On September 17, 1665, the bells of Madrid rang out to announce the death of King Philip IV of Spain. As the capital plunged into mourning, all eyes turned to his heir, a sickly 4-year-old boy who could barely hold his head upright. Carlos II, barely more than a toddler, had just inherited one of the world's most expansive empires. The Spanish monarchy that young Carlos inherited spread across Europe and spanned the globe. Its territories included much of the Americas, the Philippines, and holdings in Italy and the Low Countries. For over a century, Spain had been the dominant power in European politics. But now, this vast empire rested on the shoulders of a child who could scarcely comprehend what was happening around him. With Carlos clearly unable to rule, his mother, Mariana of Austria, assumed the regency. Mariana was both Carlos's mother and his first cousin once removed, another link in the Habsburg family's tangled genetic web. Though intelligent and determined, she faced immediate challenges. The Spanish court was a viper's nest of competing factions, and Mariana had no natural allies among the Spanish nobility. Her first controversial decision was appointing her confessor, Father Juan Everardo Nithard, as her chief minister. Nithard, an Austrian Jesuit, was deeply unpopular with the Spanish aristocracy. "A foreign priest controlling Spanish affairs," they whispered. "The Queen thinks more of Austria than Spain." The stage was set for years of bitter power struggles. While these political battles raged, little Carlos remained largely neglected. Court etiquette prevented anyone from touching the sacred person of the king without permission, so the boy received little physical affection. His education was spotty at best. How could one teach a child who struggled to form coherent sentences? Instead of learning statecraft, young Carlos was kept isolated in women's quarters far longer than most princes, surrounded by superstitious servants who reinforced his fears and insecurities. Did you know that Carlos was so sheltered that he wasn't allowed to see himself in a mirror until he was a teenager? Court officials feared the shock of seeing his own deformities might kill him. When he finally did glimpse his reflection, witnesses reported he burst into tears. By 1675, when Carlos was 14, discontent with Mariana's regency had reached a breaking point. Don Juan José of Austria, Philip IV's illegitimate son, and thus Carlos's half-brother, led a coup against the Queen's government. Mariana's favorite, Fernando de Valenzuela, was arrested, and Don Juan José seized control of the administration. For a brief moment, it seemed Spain might recover under Don Juan José's competent leadership. He was intelligent, experienced, and genuinely concerned with Spain's welfare. But fate intervened again. Don Juan José died suddenly in 1679, throwing the government back into chaos. Throughout these tumultuous years, what role did Carlos himself play? The sad truth is, very little. Official portraits showed a dignified monarch in magnificent attire, but behind closed doors, witnesses described a different reality. Foreign ambassadors reported a king who could barely follow basic conversations, who needed handlers to guide him through official ceremonies, who would suddenly burst into inappropriate laughter or tears during state functions. Carlos's signature appears on thousands of official documents, but most historians agree he likely had little understanding of what he was signing. Counselors would simplify complex issues to their most basic elements, and even then, the king often seemed confused. One minister remarked privately, "His Majesty's mind is like that of a child of 4. Meanwhile, Spain's once mighty position in Europe was crumbling. Louis XIV of France, an aggressive and ambitious ruler, began systematically dismantling Spanish power. The War of Devolution in 1667 to 1668 and the Franco-Dutch War from 1672 to 1678 both resulted in territorial losses for Spain. The Treaty of Nijmegen in 1678 forced Spain to cede Franche-Comté and several Flemish towns to France. Spain's coffers were empty, its armies understrength and poorly equipped. Colonial possessions began slipping away as pirates and rival powers picked at the empire's overextended defenses. The Spanish Netherlands remained a constant drain on resources. Administrative corruption was rampant, with nobles more concerned with their own enrichment than the welfare of the state. Perhaps most painful was the contrast between Spain's glorious past and its humiliating present. Just over a century earlier, under Philip II, Spain had been the undisputed master of Europe. Now, foreign ambassadors wrote home describing a decaying capital, a bankrupt treasury, and a king who drooled on state papers. By 1680, when Carlos was 19 and technically ruling in his own right, actual power remained in the hands of various ministers and his mother. The king's 2 marriages, first to Marie-Louise of Orléans and later to Maria Anna of Neuburg, brought no improvement to his condition and, crucially, no heirs. As the years passed, foreign powers began openly discussing how to divide the Spanish Empire after Carlos's inevitable death without an heir. The Spanish king became a pawn in international diplomacy, with little say in discussions about the future of his own kingdom. In this tragic twilight of Habsburg Spain, Carlos II wasn't so much a king as he was a symbol, the embodiment of a once mighty dynasty reduced to a genetic dead end. The vast Spanish Empire, built through conquest and marriage alliances, was now held together by little more than tradition and inertia, waiting for its final collapse. The legacy of Carlos's reign wasn't just personal tragedy, it was the end of Spain's golden age. The question isn't whether Carlos influenced the decisions that led to Spain's decline. It's whether any ruler, even a competent one, could have reversed the course of an empire already set on the path to ruin. In the grand halls of the Royal Alcazar of Madrid, a desperate drama was unfolding, one that would determine the fate of an empire. For Carlos II, King of Spain, the most fundamental duty of any monarch had become an impossible burden, producing an heir to continue his dynasty. The pressure on Carlos was immense. The Habsburg lineage in Spain hung by the thinnest of threads, his own frail existence. Since the early 16th century, when Carlos's ancestor Charles V had ruled over lands where the sun never set, the Habsburg name had been synonymous with Spanish power. Now that centuries-long legacy rested solely on a man whose very body seemed to rebel against him. In 1679, at age 18, Carlos was married to Marie-Louise of Orléans, a 17-year-old French princess and niece of Louis XIV. The young bride arrived in Spain with optimism, but was reportedly shocked when she first laid eyes on her husband. One lady-in-waiting recorded her devastation. The princess wept for 2 days without stopping. Despite this inauspicious beginning, Marie-Louise dutifully performed her role, and surprisingly, a genuine affection seemed to develop between the royal couple. The court watched anxiously for signs of pregnancy. Months passed, then years. The Queen's monthly courses continued with disappointing regularity. The pressure on the young couple became unbearable. Court physicians prescribed bizarre fertility treatments, special diets, herbal concoctions, and peculiar bedroom practices, all designed to increase the chances of conception. Marie-Louise was forced to drink strange potions and undergo humiliating physical examinations before the royal physicians. For Carlos, the treatments were even more extreme. His food was laced with powdered testicles of various animals, believed to enhance virility. He bathed in special waters, infused with herbs and minerals, thought to strengthen his seed. The royal couple's most intimate moments became matters of state concern, with schedules for intercourse determined by physicians based on astrological calculations. Behind closed doors, whispers about the king's capabilities spread through European courts. Ambassadors sent coded messages home discussing Carlos's possible impotence. Some reports suggested he could not consummate the marriage. Others claimed he could perform the act, but was incapable of producing viable seed. French diplomats referred to him as un impuissant, an impotent man. The Spanish court vigorously denied such claims, insisting the problem lay with the Queen. This brings us to a fascinating historical question. Was Carlos truly sterile? Modern medical analysis of his conditions suggests he likely suffered from hypogonadism, underdeveloped sexual organs, and reduced hormone production, along with his other genetic disorders. His severely recessed jaw and other skeletal deformities point to serious hormonal imbalances that would have affected fertility. Some historians believe his pituitary gland was damaged, preventing normal sexual development. The psychological aspects cannot be overlooked either. Carlos, painfully aware of his inadequacies and under enormous pressure, likely suffered performance anxiety. Imagine the scene. A physically deformed, mentally childlike man expected to perform sexually while knowing the fate of an empire depended on his success. The entire court watching, waiting, tracking the Queen's cycles. It's little wonder if he struggled. As the years passed without a pregnancy, Marie-Louise fell out of favor. Court factions blamed her for the lack of an heir. When she suddenly died in 1689 at age 27, just 10 years into their marriage, rumors of poisoning immediately circulated. Had she been eliminated to make way for a more fertile queen? While modern historians believe she likely died of appendicitis or a similar ailment, contemporaries were convinced of foul play. Carlos genuinely mourned his first wife, but reasons of state demanded he remarry quickly. Just months after Marie-Louise's death, he wed Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess chosen specifically for her family's reputation for fertility. Her sisters had borne many children, and the Spanish court hoped this family trait would overcome Carlos's deficiencies, but history repeated itself. Despite Maria Anna's presumed fertility, no pregnancy occurred. The new queen tried everything to conceive, consulting doctors, astrologers, and even supposed miracle workers. Carlos continued with increasingly desperate treatments. Court records indicate he was subjected to hot iron applications on his spine, believed to stimulate virility. He consumed exotic aphrodisiacs, imported at great expense from Spanish colonies. Special chocolates infused with vanilla and chili, rare herbs from the Philippines, even powdered rhinoceros horn from Africa. Did you know that Carlos actually underwent multiple exorcisms in attempts to cure his infertility? As medical approaches failed, superstition took hold. Many in the Spanish court became convinced the king was under a spell that prevented him from producing an heir. In 1699, the king himself became convinced he was hexed. He submitted to exorcism rituals performed by specially summoned priests. In one particularly grueling ceremony, Carlos was forced to drink holy oil while priests recited prayers and applied sacred relics to his body. The desperate king endured these painful and humiliating procedures, clinging to any hope of producing an heir. As Carlos's health deteriorated and the likelihood of an heir vanished, Europe's great powers began positioning themselves for the inevitable succession crisis. The Spanish Empire remained a prize worth fighting for despite its decline. Its territories spanned the globe, from the Americas to the Philippines, from Naples to the Netherlands. Whoever controlled this inheritance would dramatically alter the European balance of power. Two main candidates emerged: Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, and Archduke Charles of Austria, son of Emperor Leopold I. The French Bourbons and Austrian Habsburgs each claimed rightful succession through their connections to the Spanish royal family. Diplomatic maneuvering reached fever pitch as Carlos's health worsened in the late 1690s. Spain itself was divided. Some nobles favored the French candidate, believing Bourbon support could restore Spanish greatness. Others remained loyal to the Habsburg connection, fearing French dominance would reduce Spain to a satellite state. As Carlos grew weaker, these factions battled for influence over the dying king's final will. The succession question became Europe's most pressing diplomatic issue. Secret treaties were drafted dividing Spanish territories. The First Partition Treaty of 1698 proposed splitting the Spanish inheritance three ways. When news of this reached Madrid, Carlos was furious at foreign powers carving up his empire while he still lived. In a rare display of decisive action, he made a will naming Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria, his great-nephew, as sole heir. Fate intervened again when Joseph Ferdinand unexpectedly died in 1699, throwing succession plans into chaos. A second partition treaty followed, but Carlos rejected foreign dictates. As he approached death in 1700, at just 39 years old, the king was torn between Habsburg loyalty and Spanish interests. In the end, Carlos II made a choice that would reshape European history. On his deathbed, persuaded by advisors that only French power could keep the Spanish Empire intact, he signed a will naming Philip of Anjou, the French candidate, as his successor. With this final act, Carlos ended nearly 2 centuries of Habsburg rule in Spain. The king's failure to produce an heir had consequences far beyond his personal tragedy. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that would rage across Europe for 13 years, redrawing the map of power and permanently altering the trajectory of nations. All because one man, the living embodiment of generations of inbreeding, could not do what most men find natural: father a child. Was the lack of an heir truly Carlos's greatest failure? Or was he merely the final victim of a dynastic system that sacrificed genetic health at the altar of political advantage? Perhaps the real failure belonged to generations of Habsburg rulers who chose power over the well-being of their descendants, creating a genetic trap from which Carlos could never escape. In the year 1700, as winter descended upon Madrid, the last Habsburg king of Spain lay dying in his palace. Charles II, the man who had carried the weight of an empire on his malformed shoulders for 40 years, was finally surrendering to the inevitable. But even in his final moments, he understood that his death would unleash chaos across Europe. Charles had spent his final years tormented by a crucial decision: who would inherit his vast empire? With no children of his own, he was forced to choose between two powerful claimants. On one side stood Philip of Anjou, grandson of the French king Louis XIV, and on the other, Archduke Charles of Austria, a fellow Habsburg. After months of pressure, intrigue, and what some historians believe was manipulation by his advisors, Charles made his choice. In his last will and testament, he named Philip of Anjou, the French candidate, as his heir. Then, on November 1st, 1700, Charles II drew his final breath, and the Habsburg dynasty in Spain died with him. But this was just the beginning. Louis XIV of France had played his cards masterfully. His grandson would now rule Spain, potentially creating a French-Spanish superstate that could dominate Europe. The other European powers, particularly England, Holland, and Austria, were horrified at this prospect. Did you know that when the news of Charles's death reached Vienna, the Austrian Habsburgs were so outraged by his choice of heir that they refused to attend his funeral? They considered it a betrayal of family loyalty that had lasted for centuries. The tension exploded into what we now call the War of Spanish Succession. This wasn't just another European conflict. It was 13 years of widespread warfare that would completely reshape the continent. Armies clashed from the Spanish countryside to the German principalities. Naval battles raged in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. Colonial possessions in the Americas became battlegrounds as well. The cost in lives and treasure was staggering. Spain itself was torn apart as different regions supported different claimants. Catalonia, for instance, backed the Austrian candidate and paid a terrible price when the French candidate ultimately prevailed. Barcelona endured a brutal siege that ended in 1714, a trauma that would influence Catalan politics for centuries to come. When the dust finally settled with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, the map of Europe had been redrawn. Philip of Anjou did become King Philip V of Spain, founding the Bourbon dynasty that still reigns today. However, Spain was forced to surrender its European territories. The Spanish Netherlands, Milan, Naples, and Sicily were all stripped away. The mighty empire that Charles II had inherited was permanently dismembered. Meanwhile, Britain emerged as a major European power, gaining Gibraltar and Minorca from Spain, along with new territories in North America. Austria received most of Spain's Italian possessions. The Netherlands gained a protective barrier of fortresses against French expansion. A new balance of power had emerged. Perhaps most significantly, the treaty included provisions ensuring that the French and Spanish crowns could never be united. The nightmare of a French-Spanish superstate that had sparked the war was permanently prevented. Europe had entered a new era, one where power was more evenly distributed among several major states rather than concentrated in the hands of a single dynasty. The Habsburg dynasty, which had dominated European politics for centuries through their strategy of martial alliances, had finally lost their grip on Spain. Their famous saying, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry," had finally failed them. The genetic price of their inbreeding strategy, so tragically embodied in Charles II, had brought their Spanish line to extinction. The epitaph of Habsburg Spain was written not just in the treaties that ended the war, but in the transformation of European politics itself. The age of dynastic empires was beginning to give way to the modern system of nation-states. Charles II's death marked not just the end of a dynasty, but the end of an era in European history. How do we measure the legacy of a king who could barely rule? Charles II of Spain might have been one of history's most tragic monarchs, but his impact on world history extends far beyond his personal struggles. His life and death changed not just Spain, but the entire course of European history. At first glance, Charles's legacy seems straightforward. He was the king who lost an empire, the last gasp of a dying dynasty. But dig deeper, and you'll find a story that teaches us profound lessons about power, family, and the sometimes cruel hand of fate. Did you know that modern geneticists have calculated that Charles's DNA was more inbred than if his parents had been brother and sister? His family tree was so tangled that he had fewer great-great-great-grandparents than a typical peasant child of his time. His tragic genetic heritage became a cautionary tale that influenced royal marriage policies for generations to come. The immediate aftermath of Charles's reign was chaos. The War of Spanish Succession tore Europe apart. But from this chaos emerged a new world order. The idea of massive dynastic empires began to fade, replaced by more modern nation-states. The obsession with royal blood purity, which had dominated European politics for centuries, began to lose its grip. Perhaps Charles's most lasting legacy was as a warning about the dangers of concentrated power and genetic isolation. After his death, royal families across Europe began to recognize the importance of introducing fresh bloodlines into their dynasties. The practice of close royal intermarriage gradually declined, though it wouldn't disappear entirely until the 20th century. In Spain itself, Charles's legacy is complex. His reign marked the end of Habsburg rule and the beginning of Bourbon dynasty, which continues to this day. The loss of Spain's European territories, while traumatic at the time, ultimately allowed the country to focus more on internal development and its American colonies. Some historians argue this forced simplification of Spain's commitments actually helped the country in the long run. One of the most fascinating aspects of Charles's legacy is how it changed our understanding of leadership. His reign demonstrated that the fate of nations doesn't always rest on the decisions of strong leaders, but sometimes on biological and social forces beyond any individual's control. The Habsburg dynasty's collapse wasn't primarily due to poor decisions by Charles. He was merely the final result of choices made by generations before him. There's a certain irony in the fact that Charles, who could barely speak or read, ended up teaching the world such profound lessons. His life showed how the actions of one generation can echo through centuries, affecting countless lives. The Habsburg practice of marrying close relatives had seemed like clever political strategy in the 15th and 16th centuries, but it created a biological time bomb that finally exploded in Charles. Modern medical science has given us new insights into Charles's conditions. Doctors now believe he suffered from combined pituitary hormone deficiency, maxillary deficiency, mandibular prognathism, and a host of other genetic disorders. His case is still studied in medical schools today as an extreme example of genetic deterioration. But perhaps the most important legacy of Charles II is the human story at its heart. Behind the politics and genetics was a man who, despite his limitations, tried to fulfill his duty as best he could. Historical records show moments of surprising clarity, where Charles expressed awareness of his own limitations and genuine concern for his subjects' welfare. In the end, Charles's legacy reminds us that history isn't just about great battles and powerful decisions. Sometimes it's about the quiet tragedy of a single human being, born into circumstances beyond their control, whose personal struggle ends up changing the world. His life stands as a testament to how the personal and the political, the biological and the historical are often inseparably intertwined. The story of Charles II continues to fascinate us because it speaks to universal themes: family loyalty, the price of power, and the sometimes terrible consequences of decisions that seemed wise at the time. In studying his legacy, we learn not just about the past, but about human nature itself and the complex web of causes and effects that shapes the destiny of nations. The story of Charles II of Spain reminds us that history isn't always shaped by the mighty and the powerful. Sometimes it's the struggles of those dealt the hardest hands that leave the most lasting impact on our world. Here was a man who never asked to be king, who never wanted to bear the weight of an empire on his shoulders, yet fate had cast him in one of history's most demanding roles. Despite his severe disabilities, despite the whispers of courtiers and the mockery of foreign ambassadors, Charles faced each day with a determination that deserves our respect. His life reads like a Greek tragedy, a tale of a dynasty that reached too far, of ambitions that turned back upon themselves, of power that became poison. The Habsburg desire for control, expressed through generations of inbreeding, created in Charles a living symbol of their dynasty's decline. But perhaps that's what makes his story so compelling and relevant even today. What would have happened if Charles had been born healthy and strong? Would Spain's empire have survived intact? Would the map of Europe look different today? These questions remind us that history often turns on moments we can't control, on inherited burdens and accidents of birth. The story of Charles II isn't just about the end of a dynasty or the fall of an empire. It's about human resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. It's about the price of power and the consequences of choices that echo through generations. Most of all, it's about how even the most seemingly powerless individual can shape the course of history. As we close this chapter of history, I'd like you to consider what aspects of our present world were shaped by the life and death of this tragic king. What lessons can we learn from the Habsburgs' pursuit of power at any cost? And how might understanding this history help us make better choices for our future? If you found this journey through one of history's most fascinating stories as compelling as I have, please help us share this knowledge with others. Hit that like button, share this video with friends who love history, and subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. Don't forget to ring that notification bell to ensure you never miss our upcoming episodes exploring more fascinating chapters of history. And remember, sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about those who conquered the world, but about those who showed us the true cost of power. Until next time, keep exploring the past to understand our present. Thank you for joining me on this historical journey. What do you think? Could Spain's history have been different if Charles had been a stronger king? Share your thoughts in the comments below. See you in our next historical adventure.